Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our webinar that's about the Newham Communication Project. So this is really about supporting children's communication in the early years, and we're going to just talk through some of the key findings from our project that we are running this year. So my name is Melissa. I am Assistant Director of Research School at East London Research School. I'm a nursery class teacher here, and I am also on part-time secondment with the charity People, where I am developing a programme for parents to support STEM learning at home. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Fliss James. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, I'm Fliss, and so I'm also based at Newham Nursery School and Children's Centre in the East London Research School as a nursery teacher and evidence lead in education. And I'm also seconded to the EEF for 3 days a week as the early years content specialist as well.
Great, so let's get on. So a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your selves on mute. Having your camera on would be really great. Don't worry if your camera isn't working. I saw a message there. That's absolutely fine. If you've got any thoughts or questions, please put them in the chat. So the shape of the session today. So we're going to start by setting the scene. We're going to be talking about what the research says about supporting early communication. Then we're going to go on to talking about the Newham Communication Project, how it began and where it is now. We're going to discuss the strategies that are involved in that project, and then we're going to end with a few minutes for a bit of questions and discussion time. So I'm going to hand over to Fliss, who's going to talk to you about the EEF.
Melissa. So just going to very briefly just give you a bit of an introduction to the EEF and the Research School Network. So the Education Endowment Foundation is an educational charity dedicated to breaking the link between family income and educational achievement. And so the EEF really aims to be thinking about, raising the attainment of children from the age 3 up to 18-year-olds. And it's a real strong focus on those facing disadvantage. So other key aims are around developing essential life skills and preparing young people for the world of work and further study. And what's really great about the Education Endowment Foundation is that it's not just a grant funder, nor just a research organisation, but a charity with a moral imperative to really support teachers and senior leaders to raise attainment and close that disadvantage gap. And so the roots of this response to this educational challenge are all around the best available evidence. And that's what's really, really important about the EEF. It's about that moral imperative, really thinking about how we can use evidence to really make a difference. We focus on where we think the biggest difference can be made in teaching and learning, and supporting people on the front line, yourselves, to use this evidence to inform decision making. So you can see on the next slide, we have just a very sort of brief diagram of how the EEF works. So basically we summarise the best available evidence. And so the teaching and learning toolkit is now used by 70% of secondary schools. So additionally, there is generation of new evidence as well of what works to improve teaching and learning. And so the organisation funds independent evaluations of high potential projects. And to this date, over 190 high potential programmes with over 1.3 million children and young people have been involved in. So it's really, really powerful to see the months of additional progress that actually these programmes, these evidence-informed programmes, have had an impact on. And in terms of being able to kind of mobilize this information, it's about how we use the Research School Network to support teachers and senior leaders across the country to use this evidence. And so we have a network of research schools across the country. So just going to show you briefly a little bit more about, well, what do we mean by research evidence? So, if we want to find really quick, reliable, easy ways to find out what does this research say about what will have the biggest impact in the early years, we can use the Early Years Toolkit, and that's hosted on the EEF website. And it presents 12 approaches for improving teaching and learning, and it summarises key things. So it summarises the impact on attainment. And that's the numeral on this screenshot. It also shows the cost of an intervention, of a programme to implement. That's the pound sign. And also the strength of the evidence that underpins it. That's the padlock. What is the evidence that supports this particular programme to give this impact? So what we know when we're thinking about communication and language, which is relevant to our session today, is that, there are strategies, for example, such as the built environment, which involves changing the physical conditions of an early years setting or school classroom. They're unlikely to actually have a really direct effect on learning. Once we've got a very sort of adequate building standard in place and that has been achieved, that in of itself doesn't have a direct impact. Obviously, we want rich, stimulating, enabling environments, but in terms of the evidence, there is some limited evidence on the impact of that. So what does have an impact? Well, studies of communication and language approaches consistently show benefits for children, really positive benefits for young children's learning. And so, as we can see on here, on average, children who are involved in really robust evidence-informed communication and language approaches can make approximately 6 months additional progress over the course of a year. And that's really exciting, because actually what that allows us to do is think about, what is that evidence? So for us, when we're thinking about the Newham Communication Project, we're drawing on all of this rich evidence. And we know that what we're delivering in terms of the content is grounded in that secure evidence base. So we know that we're going to be having a positive impact. And as you can see on here, this just kind of summarizes really, just lastly, those key points. Looking at research evidence can help us make these wise choices. Best bets is the phrase that the EEF use. And it's based on the findings of the current evidence from well-designed, respected research and that has been evaluated as well. And this is international research also. So what we have here, when you think about it, is what does that mean? Evidence means a finding from a robust research project. And understanding this evidence can help us make those best decisions, really think about what are the things that we should be focusing on. Because sometimes it's important to stop doing something and actually focus on the things that are going to have the greatest impact. And we'll talk through a little bit about that in discussing our projects, about making space and time for the things that are going to have an impact. And so, we need to also think about evidence, but also rich professional expertise, because both of those are useful in their own right. And we really want to acknowledge the context within which professionals are working in. That's really important. So we've got a rich, robust research evidence, and we've got, professional expertise from yourselves. If we put those two things together, wow, that can be really powerful. And that's what is evidence-informed practice. So we're looking for that trustworthy information before we choose how to act. So we're not just relying on assumptions or, we've always just done that, habitual practice or myths. We're actually thinking about, what does that research tell us? Our children deserve it. That's the moral imperative, to make sure we get that high quality, credible evidence, use our professional expertise, our knowledge of those children, and put those two things together. So that brings us to the focus of this particular project that we're highlighting today. So, we know from so much research, and many of you will be familiar with this research, about the importance of communication, and communication being central to children's learning and development, to their thinking and their emotional well-being. Absolutely integral. It's at the heart of child development. And it's right that we give it that special focus, that we really, really make it, we sharpen our focus and think about why it's important. So when children communicate well, then they can make friends, can't they? They can play together, they can access the curriculum, they can engage in problem solving and reasoning, and really think about how to, use language to be able to communicate their needs and wants, rather than getting really frustrated or, sort of hitting out or becoming withdrawn. So powerful. And it's also, really important to note that we're thinking about the youngest children. And that's absolutely massive, you know, it's so important, but it's not just important to our young children, but also about future success in life. You know, so we know that children with broad vocabulary at the age of 5 will do better at school and have better qualifications when they leave school. And we also know that having a stronger, deeper, broader vocabulary will support learning to read. So we do also need to kind of think about these really important things in the context of having been through, or still sort of going through, a really turbulent phase. You know, we've all been very much impacted by the pandemic. And so we really need to be thinking about this, because actually, you know, the impact of COVID, lockdowns on young children, particularly in our early years context, you know, all of this feels even more timely and important. Young children have missed out on so many opportunities to play and communicate, to be able to go to the children's centre and singing sessions in the library, mixing with extended family even. So it's really, really important that we're aware of this. It's all had an impact on children's communication and language, and therefore we're seeing it in the wide impact as well. We've seen that in Sheringham with the children that we have been working with, and we really understand that you also are really kind of considering these really wide-ranging impacts and what we can do about that. So another important point is to kind of think a bit about the revised EYFS as well. So we have our focus on why we're developing this project, and we're thinking about sort of the context that we're in, you know, in terms of this other important reason to focus on communication. You know, 2 key changes to the EYFS. We really want to make sure that we are highlighting this, that we're using this evidence that we know is so important, and that it's central to what we're doing in terms of the development of our curriculum and our pedagogy and practice. We want to strengthen efforts to give children more equal life chances, and this is really part of how we can do that. And so you will see within the revised development matters, that is really reflected, that real focus on communication and language. So let's just have another think about why it's so important, why it matters so much. You know, children need those oral language skills to underpin everything: social communication, relationships, literacy, learning, and being able to develop and extend their thinking in all areas of development. But what's really interesting is just how early language ability is one of the strongest predictors of later development through school and in life. So again, if we go back to looking at some of the figures from the all-party parliamentary group on social mobility from 2019, you know, we know that vocabulary at age 5, you know, if a child has poor vocabulary at age 5, they're more than twice as likely to be unemployed at age 34. Now, these are things just to be really mindful of, aren't they? Because actually it just goes to show the wide-ranging impact on education, employment, and health. And, you know, this is a really key thing to consider, because it really makes a difference. It really makes a difference to how children can access not only their education, but those bigger life chances as well. So I'm going to talk through briefly a little bit of the actual evidence that kind of underpins some of this. So we know that there's been significant developments in the past 20 years that have really highlighted this importance of early language development. And so you can see on this slide with a couple of screenshots of particular papers that we're going to be referring to throughout the course of the webinar. Such as the Preparing for Literacy Guidance and the Underpinning Evidence Review written by James Law et al. Really interesting and robust evidence underpinning guidance. There's also the EIF, language as a wellbeing indicator, really important. And we're also going to talk a bit about the Effective Strategies Review that was compiled as part of the Manor Park Talks project, which is the first version of the Newham Communication Project. But the point is that this research evidence really does show some really key things. First and foremost, the range and individual variation between children and their language development, and the sensitivity language development has to environmental input. really, really important. So we're looking at two really key things there, because actually, that means that we need to be really knowledgeable and aware of child development and the typical development that the typical developmental stages that children progress through, but also, in addition, that sensitivity to what that input looks like. And we're going to kind of really dig into that and give you lots of opportunities to think about the kinds of strategies to really make a difference to that input that we offer our children. So if we think a bit about the preparing for literacy guidance, so the Education Endowment Foundation creates guidance reports, and the one that has been really it's sort of integral to our communication projects, both Manapart Talks and the Newham Communication Project, is the Preparing for Literacy Guidance, which has a series of recommendations. And again, what this is about how the Education Endowment Foundation takes all this rich evidence and distills it into actionable recommendations that we as early years teachers and educators can take and really think about how we can put those into practice in our classrooms. And so, as we can see here, we've got a really important first recommendation, and we can't sort of emphasize this enough, prioritizing the development of communication language. Really, really powerful, really important. We need to think about how we can pull all that rich evidence and understand what that looks like. So we know that oral language is key to a child's development and provides the foundation of thinking and learning and should be prioritized. We know that communication language lay those foundations, particularly for literacy skills. And again, as I've sort of already highlighted, those other really important life skills and learning and development. But also it's thinking about, at all levels of communicative development in those preschool years, from that birth to 5 phase in the early years, the right environmental support has the potential to make this real difference. And that's really important as well. And so when we think about the role that adults have to play, it's absolutely vital in modeling effective language communication. And those high quality adult-child interactions are crucial in terms of sometimes being described as talking sort of with children and not just to them. Really, really important. So I'm going to just sort of show you a little bit more of that information that underpins the guidance report. Because as I'd sort of highlighted already, we need to be thinking about exploring typical language development and what that actually looks like. And so underpinning the Preparing for Literacy guidance is this early language development report. And what we need to kind of really be mindful of is, as we've discovered in the last sort of 20 years, is that there is this general kind of general progression through a series of distinct but overlapping stages. And that's where that individual variation is absolutely really important, that we're aware of that individual variation. Children will follow similar patterns in a particular language, but that will happen at different rates. And we have to be really mindful of that, particularly for very young children, that we are aware that there are these distinct but overlapping stages, but also that actually because of that variation and that sensitivity to input, that we have to be really mindful and considered when we're thinking about whether children may have any speech language communication needs. We have to be aware of that, be sensitive to that variation. It's a very robust process, language acquisition, but it is so important to consider that quality of input. We know that both quality and quantity are important, but that quality seems to be the most important thing than the quantity. And so many of you will have heard of research previously, particularly around the 30 million word gap. And so what we're going to show you in just a moment is just a very short snippet, just kind of summarizing a little bit more of the more recent research, moving on from the Hart and Risley study in the 1990s, which really looked at the sort of conversational sort of exposure, because actually what that research generated was a very, very big body of kind of work around trying to understand this word gap, and was based very much around looking at socioeconomic status of the families that were involved in this particular study. But what's really exciting is new neuroscientific research. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this little snippet of research will play, and you'll get a little bit of a summary of thinking about the research beyond the 30 million word gap. So a very brief just snippet of the research that had been carried out in 2018 by Rachel Romeo et al. At Harvard. And it's really interesting because what they looked at was how exactly the language environment influences children's outcomes, and really challenged some of all of that body of research thinking about the word gap, and started to look at how conversational turns may be particularly important for language development because of the opportunities that they provide for children to practice language and receive feedback from adults. Really, really interesting. And so actually what we're going to just think about now and have another really short clip of is thinking about, well, what does this mean from those earliest stages of development? What does it mean from birth to be able to actually engage in conversation? So again, many of you will have heard the phrase serve and return interactions. And these are essentially the early conversations. Because what we know from the evidence is, babies are listening, studying and observing, they're really primed and ready to interact. Children enter, we're born as humans with that drive to interact. We're motivated to have that communication. That's amazing, really, isn't it? And so when we think about it, we need to kind of really reflect on that and the impact that that has for children and language development and all of the other elements that come with it. Because actually, when babies start to make those vocalizations, those coos and gurgles and squeals, and actually when an adult starts to kind of engage with that, and has that serve and return, that almost like a game of tennis or ping pong, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That conversation has started, and one that will really help children to kind of start to make connections between words, sentences, and much richer language. And it's fascinating because, babies' brains are kind of waiting for that back and forth, because what that helps is it helps them to kind of sort and sift through the language. And I really quite like the phrase, the sound soup that babies are surrounded in. They've got to actually be able to isolate and segment words from this stream of sounds that surround them. That's so, so tricky. But actually it's amazing, isn't it? Because the human mind, human brain is hardwired to pick out patterns. But that social interaction, that input, puts those patterns into context, receiving smiles, nods, reinforcement, really kind of building that rapport and that connection. It's quite remarkable when you watch it in action. And that's what we want to kind of really be considering, is this idea of that actually, it's never too early for that conversation. It's never too early to have those interactions. That call and response process activates those auditory centers of the brain, but also those areas of motor response as well. So actually, before babies are even using words and talking, engaging with them, engaging with people speaking to them, actually activates the centers in the brain, those motor centers in the brain needed for response once their vocal mechanism has developed. So it's really quite fascinating. So what we're going to see now is a really short clip, which I just think is just so joyful because it shows this lovely interaction, this early conversation, that serve and return between a mum and her 10-week-old baby called Ellie. So on the next slide, you should see.
Oh. 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 Oh.
What I think is really fascinating about that is not only is it just joyful, it's kind of really heartwarming, isn't it? But actually how the parent, the caregiver pauses as well. And there's that space within the interaction too, and actually the sustained back and forth. Once that's kind of really developed, that's the foundations for conversation. And so we know from that neuroscientific evidence that actually that back and forth interaction is kind of firing connections in children's brains, and actually it leads to the beginnings of these verbal conversations that we will be focusing on in our settings. So just to show you that in practice, and just to get you really thinking about just how powerful that input is, and really thinking about how babies are just born into this world ready and motivated to communicate. So when we think about this and those interactions, and we're thinking about what that actually looks like, wow, we've got that early rich information of what babies are doing with their caregivers and how that builds up over time with the right kinds of experiences. And what we found, and this is really highlighted from the projects that we're talking about today, is just, again, the importance of being able to tune in and listen to children and have those conversations. And so, as we can see on the bottom of this slide, that statement from the Preparing for Literacy Guidance report about high quality adult-child interactions are important, and sometimes talking with children. So I see Ellie and the mum, even at 10 weeks, there's still that with, isn't it? There's that interaction that's so powerful. It's not just talking to, there's actually that back and forth interaction. And so we've looked at this research and how central and vital our role is. And so now let's think about what this looks like in our projects. So we kind of set that scene, really highlighted just how powerful, it is to understand language development, understand that typical development, but also the variation, and also really thinking about the sensitivity to input. So the first project we ran was called Manor Park Talks, and we're based in the Manor Park area of Newham in East London. And so this particular pilot was funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. And the aim of it was to kind of really sort of think about whether we could see, this evidence in practice, in an intervention, to see if we could actually have an impact. And so that was really exciting, because actually it was developed a whole professional development program delivered by Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre, and focus very much on thinking about how can we develop the workforce, how can we upskill and really sort of give early years practitioners that expertise in supporting children's early language and communication. It was based on the Every Child a Talker programme, which many of you will be aware of, and how impactful that was and influential that has been to so much of what we're doing now. So on this slide, you can see that there are two kind of images. So we have two things that came out of this particular programme. It was the effective strategies review was the aim of this was to review the recent empirical evidence that had been available from around 2008 about what are those effective strategies to support early language development for children aged 2 to 5. So we focused on 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds in this project, but the evidence review actually looked, at that breadth from 2 to 5-year-olds. So what we started off with was quite a number of strategies. And throughout the kind of pilot, what we found, which is really interesting, was about how we needed to reduce some of those strategies. And so it primarily became an intervention, a focus about conversational responsiveness. So we honed in on all of that, that wonderful, rich conversation to really give this overarching principle at the centre, which is that idea of being listened to and listening to children and having conversations with them. And so we created a poster, and this was a co-construction with the participants and also the trainers and academics involved. And so that central kind of big circle of really thinking about this is what we know is going to have an impact, listening to children and having conversations with them, and looking at the strategies down the side, and also thinking about shared book reading as well. So we've kept so many of these important things in the Newham Communication Project. The pilot was really successful, and the evaluation that was carried out as part of the pilot, funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, found that actually the revised intervention could be implemented. It was ready to be implemented across settings across Newham as a local authority. And so that's what we started this year. So we've done a lot of real thinking and hard work to really kind of refine and adapt the programme. So I'm going to just talk a bit more about the review that underpinned this. And so when we looked at this evidence, it was fascinating because the findings of this particular intervention showed such promising effects on children's outcomes by really thinking about specific pedagogical strategies that were targeted. And so what was really interesting was that there were 3 kind of key themes that emerged from this effective strategies review. So we looked at the evidence from 2008 from children aged 2 to 5. And what was pulled out from that was that, firstly, the impact of professional development is absolutely paramount. It's really, really important. We really need to make sure that we're aware of how that is an actual sort of crucial determinant of the overall impact on children's communication and language development. And then the research evidence was grouped into 3 themes. And I think this is really interesting. Firstly, the first theme that came through was about attending to children's social and emotional development. So actually, the evidence shows the importance of maximising children's potential by engaging them in these rich and socially meaningful interactions, and that practitioners need to be really aware of how to provide that emotional support, which significantly enhances children's linguistic productivity. So it's a really obvious thing when you think about it, but to have that backed up by the evidence is really powerful. We need to be aware. We need to be attending to children's social and emotional development. We need to have those relationships, nurturing, responsive, strong relationships. We need to know those children well. And we also need to cultivate that sort of and foster that sort of emotional support, because actually, if we think about it, particularly with really young children, if we're not supporting their emotional well-being and providing that support and that nurturing environment, they're not going to be motivated to talk to us. So actually, just so critical and really brilliant that was highlighted in this particular review. Okay, so second theme was thinking about adults as active partners in the conversation process. Brilliant. Just so critical that adults must reflect carefully on their roles. You know, the adult has this absolute vital process to model language structures, conversational norms. Scaffolding is critical. We've got to scaffold children's attempts to communicate, and we need to really listen as well. We need to listen to children's attempts to engage in conversation. We need to respond to their lead, and we need to think about how to create those spaces so we've got that kind of, you know, joint engagement. And that's in adult, you know, sort of led opportunities as well as child-led activities and play. We need to think about it in both of those contexts. And thirdly, thinking about valuing the complexity, diversity, and duration of language exposure. And so really what that means is about the kinds of the other words, really thinking about how hearing many words of varying complexity over prolonged periods of time, and that these words are repeated in many different contexts. That's vitally important, that repetition, that variation, the increasing complexity, and children having that time so that they can kind of bump back into these words, and adults, you know, as those active partners attending to the children's social and emotional development, thinking about those three critical things. So we're going to talk a bit now about what we learn from Manor Park Talks, what the differences between the two projects are. And so Melissa's going to delve into this and think about some of those really important things about the professional development.
Thank you, Fliss. Yeah, so we are always learning, and we certainly didn't get it right, and evaluating our projects as we go along is a very important part of the way that we work. And so the effective strategies review, as Fliss was saying, really spoke about the importance of that, the impact of professional development, and it having a direct impact on children's communication and language development. So since we knew that, we knew we had to pay close and careful attention to it. One of the things we discovered in Manor Park Talks is that we need to be really careful about being clear. Clarity was a real important factor. So there was a little bit of confusion amongst some of the participants. So we worked very hard on that in the Newham Communication Project. And the other thing is making the model much simpler. So in Newham Communication Project, you can see that
Just lost Melissa there. Or is everybody else still see us? I'll try and carry on while she
maintain nurseries,
okay.
And they were the ones that did the support. But the practicalities of running the project in terms of professional development was really important to its success. Is my internet going funny? It looks a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, we lost you briefly, but you're back.
Oh,
so.
Okay, that's good. Right, fingers crossed, because I think it's saying my internet's a little bit unstable, but we'll soldier on. Yes, so the practicalities of running the project in terms of professional development was really important. And it was difficult and it was messy. And, you know, we were working with private nurseries, and the pressures that they are under and the different circumstances in which they work was an important factor to bear in mind, but it made it difficult to make it work for everyone. So that's something that we're still reflecting on now. Yeah, so if I just go on to this is the theory of change. So this is just drawing everything together so that we can think about the project as a whole and what we are going to do to affect change in the short and long term. So at the beginning, you can see the why. So this is the things that Fliss has already spoken about, you know, so how important language is, the impact of COVID, who the children were. So well, that was children who were 2 and 3 years old in settings in Newham. The how is practitioners learning the theory and practice behind effective strategies to support children's communication and language, and also engaging parents. That was part of the project too. The short-term outcomes were practitioners and parents put the effective strategies they've learned into practice. The quality of early years provision improves, and then the long-term outcome would be that children are at lower risk of language delay and the associated negative outcomes as they develop. And this is a really crucial thing. It's the best for every child. So this quote at the top is from Law et al. Report from 2017, and it says early language development generally progresses through a series of distinct but overlapping stages, and the majority of children follow similar patterns in a given language, just at different rates. And that's the thing that Fliss was talking about earlier. You know, we have to pay real close attention to that. And the principal aim of this project is really about improving the general quality of provision overall. So this will then meet the needs of all children, the vast majority of children. And it also, putting this into place in settings is going to help us make better referrals to SALT when we are concerned about a child, because you can say, I've used this strategy, I've used that strategy, but there is still a difficulty. So in the communication project, we've been using the Send Hub as our partners. So where children need additional support in communication, we can draw on their experience. But the overall aim is about quality first provision and establishing that really basic practice and then being responsive from that point. And it's just about a tiered approach. So how will we put this into practice? What did we do? How did we make sure that all the staff involved in the project were making a difference for every child every day? So we're just going to talk a little bit about professional development, because paying close attention to the features of high quality professional development and incorporating that into our project, as I said earlier, is just really important. So the first thing we did was we thought carefully about the content. What should be in the professional development? What do practitioners need to know? So we need to give practitioners a secure grounding in professional knowledge. And in this project, it was what typical language development looked like. Then what does the research say about what children need to learn to be successful? And then about that pedagogy. How are we going to help children to develop their communication? We also really need to dig into and support the development of adults' interactions with children. So that's from supporting children's emotional well-being to being responsive and adaptive. Interactions are absolutely key. And in the Newham Communication Project, we use video exemplification of interactions in our training just to really highlight what those high quality interactions look like. We also supported managers to use peer-to-peer support to develop these in their settings, and that the managers got a lot of support from their mentors in developing those interactions. We know that supporting high quality teaching is pivotal in improving children's outcomes. The research tells us that high quality teaching can narrow the disadvantage gap. So effective professional development plays a crucial role in improving classroom practice and therefore pupil outcomes. And the EEF have produced a guidance report that offers recommendations on how to improve professional development and design and select more impactful professional development. So the cogs that you can see down there in the corner, they are from the professional development guidance report, and they have been really crucial in our development, the design of the Newham Communication Project. And I really recommend that as a guidance report to read going forwards. I think it's really useful, and those cogs especially, it is really great to have a little look at that and think about your professional development as a setting. The thing that was really challenging for this project was finding times for practitioners to meet and discuss and reflect. And that's a really crucial part of professional development. So we made sure that there was time for reflection in our twilight trainings, but finding time in the setting was tricky, but we really did support practitioners to prioritize that. And the hub meeting was a very important element of that sustained continuous support, because as we know, the guidance report says the evidence is telling us that one-off twilights are unlikely to be effective. The other guidance report that I really recommend having a look at is the School's Guide to Implementation. That's where that little cake diagram comes from at the bottom. And the benefit of looking at this model is that we tend to overload ourselves and our teams. And this guidance report is really encouraging us to streamline. And it's really about doing fewer things better. So I'm going to go on to talk about the strategies that we used in Newham Communication Project. So these are the strategies. The overarching strategy stayed the same as it was in Manor Park Talks, listening to children, having conversations, but we really did look at the strategies and try and simplify them. So all of the research evidence and our experience with that Manapart talks led us to this adaptation. So the overarching strategy stayed the same, but where multiple turn conversations are our goal, because we know that these sustained interactions give children rich experiences full of opportunities to develop communication, express their thoughts and feelings. Conversations are powerful for language learning because they allow children to hear new language, rehearse skills in a social context, and receive responsive and adaptive language feedback from adults. So this means we need to support practitioners to develop, to reflect on the individuality of children they are working with and really think about their current level of development. So children learn best when the language they hear is just above their current level and is responsive. So we must be responsive and adaptive. And all of these need to be done at the same time. All of those strategies there need to be done at the same time, woven together all the time for every child. And it's important that one strategy isn't done in isolation because it wouldn't have an impact. So if you were just to, for example, use the 10-second rule where you're giving children time to think, that's not going to have an impact or the same impact as if you wove them together with the Shrek, the comment more and question less. So I'm going to go into these strategies in a little bit more detail now, so you'll have an understanding of what they're about, because Shrek at first look might sound a bit strange, but it's actually brilliant, and hopefully we can communicate that to you. Yeah, and just to say that these strategies work for all children. If you're adaptive and responsive, they will work for children who have English as an additional language and children who have additional needs too. So Shrek. So this is the acronym that we're using in Newham Communication Project, and we have moved away from OWL, observe, wait, listen, because we felt that it was too passive, and really what happens after you've observed and you've waited and you've listened, you need some action, you need to do something. So this is where we've arrived at, Shrek. So the S and the H stand for share attention. So this is making time to really tune into the child, join their play, and crucially, both pay attention to the same thing. So tuning into the child's current focus of attention and labeling objects of interests. And that's really related to children's expressive vocabulary. And it can be misinterpreted. You know, sharing attention is not that the child is paying attention to what you are interested in. It really is about looking at what that child is focused on. So if you see in that picture on that slide, that's why we've chosen that. You know, the child is really focused on something and the mum is then looking to at the same thing. So the R then is for respond. What could your response look like? Well, we think it should be that you're looking expectantly, you know, you're noticing their communication, be that verbal or non-verbal, and you're acknowledging their communication. And that's with warm, responsive, being responsive with eye contact, body language, smiling and nodding. Then we've got expand. So this needs to be responsive and adaptive. This is where you can make those adaptations depending on the child's level of development. So it's really pitched for that individual child, just above their level of development, scaffolding their learning. So expansions could be providing new words, you know, the meanings of words. So how the words can be used in different sentences. It could be labeling objects for younger children. For older children, it could be about descriptive words, talking about emotions, giving different words for the same thing. And that idea of many and varied, you know, different words for big, huge, humongous, enormous, explaining the meanings of words, and really giving information about past or present, comparing and contrasting. And it's also about really adding some words, so recasting what they've said and repeating it back as a sentence. Then we've got the ultimate aim is the C, so conversation. Conversation is, like we've spoken about, is what all the evidence is pointed to is the most powerful thing for children and supporting their communication language. It's that serve and return, like tennis, multiple turn conversations back and forth. So weaved in through and alongside Shrek are other strategies I'm going to talk about, but first I'm going to hand over to Fliss because she has adapted Shrek in her role with the EEF.
Thanks, Melissa. So we kind of have taken this and created, sort of hopefully a simple kind of memorable sort of graphic that people can kind of look at and really kind of just sort of, I guess, you know, sort of refine some of the statements so that they were really short and snappy. And so we've got this idea of kind of like this wedge, you know, that actually, you know, you're starting with the sharing of attention, you know, that the adult is down at the child's level, be at the child's level, pay attention to what they're focused on. So try to really kind of succinctly capture what that looks like. And then the respond, you know, actually, again, following the child's lead, responding to that verbal and non-verbal, you know, and actually that point that one of the first things you can really do is just make a brief comment about, you know, what the child can see, hear, feel, what they're doing. So just a comment and really think about what that response can look like. And then as Melissa was explaining the expansion, you know, how can we expand children's language? How can we make sure that actually, you know, we're sort of repeating back what the child said. So you're acknowledging what they've said and then adding that extra information. You're turning words into sentences, but you're also thinking about concepts as well, depending on that child. And then again, finally, that conversation, so you can see how it kind of gets broader into this back and forth interaction. You know, we're wanting to get that kind of rally underway so that you have extended back and forth interactions and that you give children time to listen, process and reply. So we try to kind of just, summarize that into this sort of memorable graphic that people can look at and be able to kind of go, okay, yeah, I can kind of tune into that and I can be responsive and start to engage children in these high quality interactions. Because to quote the statement from Preparing for Literacy, you know, when done well, high quality interactions often look effortless, but they're not easy to do well. And so actually we've got to really give people the right kind of skills. And the point is that these are evidence informed. We know that they are from that rich body of research. So I'm going to hand back to Melissa now, and so she can kind of talk through some of the other elements that we focused on in the Newham communication project.
Thank you. So yeah, threaded through this is comment more, question less. And this is really about encouraging conversations and moving away from the rigidity of the 4-finger rule, which was something part of the Manapart Talks program. So not to overload with too many questions. Although sometimes a question is useful, but too many tends to shut conversations down, especially if it's a closed question. So using open questions is useful, but a closed question that you know the answer to, like what color is that, is not a useful strategy. So when you use questioning, it's about being effective, so really sparing. So useful questions could be, I wonder why, or what could happen next? Just pondering, I wonder, is a really useful thing to do. And questions are actually quite a useful way to cue a turn. It does support what a conversation looks like, the idea that someone speaks and then another person speaks, that turn-taking element, but you can really overdo it. It gives you an opportunity to invite children to elaborate, of course. So there are useful things about questions. The next one is the 10-second rule. So this is really about giving children time to process what you've said or what you've asked. It actually feels like a really long time, but we need to avoid, as practitioners, filling silences. Allow children that time. We need children to feel that they aren't rushed, that we are really dedicating that time and attention to them, that there's no hurry, that we will wait. They are important to us. Having that conversation with them is valuable, and we want to show them that by just slowing down, not filling those gaps. If you try waiting 10 seconds, count in your head, you'll feel that it's actually quite a long time, but it's a fantastic practice to get into. So the final strategy I'm going to talk about from NCP is shared book reading. So this is not about reading books where the the children a silent audience, but it's really about looking at books together in a warm, lovely conversation about the pictures. So that this is a strategy that's highlighted in a lot of research we've spoken about today, and it's just a really powerful vehicle for developing conversation. The quality of the books is important, and the Book Trust has some really good guidance on the types of books to use, but it's just a wonderful way of supporting all of those strategies that we've spoken about before. So you can use books as a vehicle for Shrek, as a vehicle for comment more, question less, and about really giving those 10 seconds, waiting for children to respond, allowing them time to look at the pictures and think about what they want to say, or think about what you've said to them. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to have a little look at a clip, and this is a clip from Siren Films. And we think that this is a very good example of those strategies. And I just want you to have a look at it and see which of those strategies you can see, and reflect on it and think about your own practice and the practice of your colleagues. We love this clip, we use it a lot. So this is called Elsa and the Volcanoes, and hopefully my internet will work for you.
Is there anything else you want to tell me about this? Who's this here?
That's a frog that's been eaten by that volcano.
I didn't know volcanoes could eat things. That's amazing.
Yeah, and then it's,
So is the frog inside the volcano?
yeah,
Oh, I understand.
and if it ripped out, because it's a bit jumpy to get out of that volcano.
That is
Or
really
it can
high.
get out of that volcano.
But not if there's lava there, it can't. 'Cause it would get burnt, wouldn't it?
The lava might let it out
Do you think?
of that one, or that one, or that one, or that.
I think the lava would burn the frog because the lava is so hot. So the frog would have to find a way out where there was no lava.
Or maybe he will just boing out.
Maybe because he can jump so high.
Yeah, and maybe it won't get burned.
That's good. I hope he doesn't get burned because that wouldn't be very nice, would it?
Well, if he jumped right over there, it might jump into the sky.
It might, like a flying frog.
Yeah!
What about these bits down here? This looks like a person.
Elsa. And Elsa's right come in. And that volcano ate Elsa.
No, it's really interesting that you've mentioned Elsa because Elsa has powers to freeze things, doesn't she?
And she can freeze volcanoes lava.
Yeah, she could freeze the volcano lava.
So the frogs can get out.
Oh, yes. So Elsa can freeze the lava and then all of the frogs can escape.
Yeah, and all the others get dark. That whale needs to get out of that one because that one is. And you know what? That one just is that whale.
That's a whale.
Yeah, because the whale is being eaten by that one.
Oh, the whale's inside the volcano. Actually, there are volcanoes under the sea,
Under the sea.
and they are the most dangerous kind of volcanoes because we can't see them. They hide under the water, and we don't know where they are. So some really, really clever scientists have had to find out where they are.
Seen some secret puzzles. And if
Did you?
that whale can get out of there, it can go back in the water.
Yeah, so even the whales under the sea.
Is there Anna in here?
Is Anna in there?
No.
Where is Anna?
Right there in the sea.
In the
That's
sea.
the sea where the volcano is melting on.
Oh,
And then Elsa needs to rush and get but she hasn't got any arms or legs. I'll do it. I wouldn't do about her I wouldn't do about okay, and I will do over her over feet
I like the way that you're working together. Is there anything else?
So I just, hopefully that will have given you some food for thought and really seen those strategies in action. I'm going to hand back to Fliss.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, we love that video because actually, you know, there's a really rich interaction, isn't it? You know, when you think about all of those kind of strategies that we've talked about and actually how that practitioner is making that space and time for that to happen. And so what I kind of just want to briefly kind of think about now is this, going back to this idea of the importance of vocabulary. So we want, you know, we want to offer children the opportunity to develop a broader and richer vocabulary. And so we're thinking about this primarily through this project, through the context of, in the context of listening to children and having conversations. So these points here are taken from the Preparing for Literacy Guidance report, which is about just highlighting again what the evidence says in terms of making sure that we provide children with that rich language environment. And we need to think about implicit and explicit approaches to developing children's vocabulary, you know, because there is still relatively limited evidence about how best to improve vocabulary. But what we know from the existing evidence shows that there are some important things to consider. You know, so we need to kind of think about, you know, the kind of words that children are specifically taught, and thinking about, you know, the number of words and also the understanding of relationships between words and the breadth and depth, you know, and providing all those kind of multiple opportunities to hear and use new vocabulary. So hopefully you can see that on this slide here, we're kind of drawing again from that evidence base, and we can see, like with the Manor Park Talks evidence review, you know, many and varied words, really, really important. And actually a rich language environment, those implicit approaches are all about the interactions that we have as well. Yes, we do need to think about explicitly teaching children vocabulary, and that is really important. But we're thinking just about how to be able to kind of think about that, you know, the varying words, the varying complexity of words, and the kinds of time frames that we offer for children as well. And so actually, when we think about Elsa on the volcanoes, what strikes me there is that adult, through the vehicle of conversation, is really kind of giving those children quite rich vocabulary. Think about lava and volcano, you know, that's all kind of important information for those children, but it's all about that socially meaningful context. She's down at their level, she's sharing their attention and focus, but what she's doing within that is giving them opportunity to develop a broader and richer vocabulary. Another element of that, which I think is really interesting and really important, and there's an increasing body of evidence around this, is the idea of decontextualized talk. And so what we mean by that is that idea of going beyond the here and now. And again, I think Elsa and the volcanoes and that conversation that practitioner is having with those children highlights that really nicely. So we're referring to things and events that are not physically present, you know, so they're talking about something imaginative, you know, that pretense, talking about explanations of things where the adults giving the children that information, that rich information about volcanoes, and saying, oh, you know, actually there are volcanoes even under the sea. You can see kind of the cogs whirring as the children are engaging with that adult. So it's that socially meaningful context. But the point is that decontextualized talk really supports vocabulary development, because what it offers is this, you know, we're broadening children's understanding of meaning. It's not just about what's happening here and now. What's happening here and now is really important for very young children, you know, 12 to 24-month-olds. But actually, as children progress, particularly from 2 upwards, you know, they benefit from hearing a variety of sophisticated words, of words that are actually, you know, new and infrequent and unusual. Like, children love learning new things. So this idea of decontextualized talk fits very well into conversation, doesn't it? Because it's, you know, introducing this different set of words and giving very explicit explanation about things, and also kind of talking about what we did yesterday, what we're going to do tomorrow. So actually really quite powerful. And there's research carried out by Meredith Rowe that really kind of looks at that sort of language input, particularly with parents as well, and how we can kind of really support children, particularly 3 and 4-year-olds, how they can benefit from conversations about past and future events, as well as those explanations. It's really quite interesting. When you start to really think about it, it really helps you kind of go beyond, you know, those expansions, those conversations where we're adding all of that rich information, but really enhancing children's vocabulary. So what we want to be thinking about, just to really kind of summarize all of these things around listening to children, having conversations, is the power of these everyday conversations and interactions. You know, we want you to reflect on, and we have been reflecting on, the importance of language promoting strategies in naturalistic everyday situations that really help model all those new words. We want to make the most of routines, getting dressed, snack times, meal times, tidy up times, but also that idea of considering how we can intentionally, and I think that's a really important word, that intentional practice of dedicating space and time, you know, really thinking about how we can do that. That practitioner in the video was dedicating space and time to have a rich, sustained back and forth conversation for those 2 children, really focused on what they were interested in. She could weave in all those key things. She was aware of giving them time. She was extending, expanding, elaborating, but also still following their lead. She was using questions, but sparingly, and thinking about comments as well. So really important, because what we want to do ultimately is make sure that children hear lots of talk, but it has to be responsive and engaging, as well as linguistically adapted to that child's level. And it has to be as well, if we really want to make a difference, a bit conceptually challenging. So it depends on that knowledge that we have of those children in the context of strong, nurturing, responsive relationships, but also understanding, as we talked about right at the beginning, that development, that child. So we're developmentally informed, that awareness of those stages that children go through, but also being really mindful of how that variation will be quite broad amongst our children. So that's to really kind of summarize everything that we've talked about today, and hopefully giving you a really good picture of the 2 key projects and that evidence base that we've drawn on. So we're going to just spend the last few moments of the session really just hand over to you. Questions, thoughts, anything you want to share, we'd love to hear. And feel free to pop things in the chat if you don't want to unmute, because there is also that as well. We do appreciate that.
Hiya, the Manor Park Talks document, is there a way of being able to get a hold of that?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
I just kind of had a look on the website, like there was a link, but it just said the page didn't exist.
Oh, yeah, we can pop that in either in the chat or send it out in an email as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting review, actually. It's well kind of constructed, so you get to really understand the summary of those of that research.
Yeah.
I also want more examples of good quality conversation, because you think you can actually.
I think we're just kind of, I think here we're just really working on those high quality interactions and just making sure that we have more time where we're actually spending time with the children, not getting them to be necessarily doing an activity that we've decided they're going to do.
Yeah.
You get a lot more engagement as well, don't you? It's a full package when you're going in with what their interests are.
Absolutely, absolutely. So powerful, isn't it? And I think, you know, we have to think about it as the evidence has shown that we can do that in both something that the child has led, but also there will be those guided, scaffolded contexts as well. There's a couple of questions just in the chat that are really important to raise. So Emma has asked a brilliant question, and actually we have done a whole session on this, and we can link you to another webinar. But in terms of thinking about children who have English as an additional language and thinking about multilingualism, we're not using any kind of additional strategies, because what we know from the evidence is that those strategies that we've identified, the Shrek, that sharing of attention, that attunement, following the children's lead and being responsive and adaptive, is very powerful for all children. So that's children who have additional languages and also children who have speech language communication needs as well. We know that these strategies can work for all children. And what the point of that is actually goes back to that whole, vital kind of critical thing of knowing those children. So knowing those children, having that strong relationship, understanding developmentally where they are in their acquisition of English, what the strengths are in their home language or languages, and actually thinking about how to intentionally use these strategies, make space and time for it. But we don't need anything different per se. We just need to make sure we give children those opportunities and that we direct our attention to those children who need those strategies the most. And that may well be children who are at those earliest stages. I hope that answers your question. And Sophie's asked a bit about the professional development. How many sessions do you run over the year? That's a really good question, isn't it? So I think that's a good question for you to answer, Melissa, about kind of the structure of how we've sort of organised it.
Yeah, definitely. So at the beginning, we had a launch session. We provided training for the mentors who were part of the project. That was a big part of our beginning bits. We had a launch session for the managers of the private nursery in the early years leads. And then we had 8 twilight sessions. So where we went through, they were 1 hour long. So we had a session on language development, a session on multilingualism, a session on inclusion. And then in between those twilight sessions, managers and early years leads were meeting with their mentors. So they were having a hub meeting where a number of different settings all came together and they reflected on the learning in the twilight sessions. They developed action plans. They spoke about how they were going to manage their peer-to-peer support. So it was, and that's continued. So our 8 twilight sessions have finished now, but the hub meetings continue for the whole year. So I hope that's helpful.
Another question. I'm just popping some links in the chat. And just Sinead, any particular strategies for parents? Actually, they're the same strategies. Yeah, we've really kind of reviewed the evidence. It's really interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Tiny Happy People, which is on the BBC. And actually what's really interesting is that, they, for example, they have a video, several videos and information about how to use decontextualized talk with parents. And they use that term, decontextualized talk, as well. So actually, if you go on to that as an example, that particular website, you'll see videos, guidance, all linked to the evidence that we've kind of linked to as well. Additionally, we also have the sort of revised what to expect in the early years foundation stage document, which again kind of gives clear and hopefully actionable and accessible kind of strategies that support all the areas of learning and development, but does highlight strategies for engaging in conversation with their children. Just really kind of talking about that back and forth from the earliest stages. Quick look, see if there's anything else.
I think someone's asked if the recording will be available, which it will.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll get that
Okay.
sent out to you.
So we'll just look at next steps. There are various places you can look. So we've got a multilingualism webinar that's on the East London Research School website. There's also a preparing for literacy webinar, which would be really useful to have a look at. I think, Fliss, can you stick some of those in the chat for me?
I'll pop those in now. Yeah.
Super. Fliss has written 2 brilliant blogs to go with her Shrek model that are really worth a read. They're on the EEF website and we'll get those in the chat too. And yeah, there'll be a preparing for literacy program from September onwards if you're interested in that too. So please connect with us for further training and development. These are the different ways you can connect with the research school. And I'll just wait a few minutes for Fliss to put those things into the chat for you.
A link to blogs, and there's sort of a series of 3 of them, and also just pop the web page up. But yeah, we can stay around for a few moments if anyone wants to ask any other questions. So I'll stop recording now, and then you'll have the opportunity to just ask anything else that you would like to know about.